Now, with all that's happening in the world today, from a refugee crisis in Europe to the latest on the Iran nuclear deal and American politics in a year that might shape up to be like none other ever in history, we thought we'd spend some time talking about these and other issues with the editor and publisher of The Nation, Katrina vanden Heuvel. She always was a frequent guest of ours. She writes a weekly column for The Washington Post. Her latest piece is entitled, "Hawks Aren't Giving the Iran Deal a Chance." Katrina joins me from New York. We thank her as always. First, Katrina, your reaction to Trump's speech aboard the USS Iowa.
I thought it was a speech more about national insecurity than national security. Larry, you know, it was light on specifics, let's be honest. It was more spectacle than substance, that is Donald Trump. And it really featured, you know, an amplification of what he considers his main security plank, which is to deport 11 million people, to build a wall, to call people names, and to show he is a bully. So I thought it was, you know, pretty mean-spirited. I also think, you know, on the Veterans Administration, I think had a scandal a year or so ago. There was cross-partisan work to repair the VA, which is one of the great institutions in this country. John McCain and Bernie Sanders worked together. And so for Donald Trump just to say it's lousy and let's break it up, I think is more about being a destroyer than a builder. So
how do you account, Katrina, for now stories that one in the LA Times today, that he might be the nominee?
You know, Larry, you began the show by saying these are extraordinary, unprecedented times, and I second that emotion. We're living in times when rules are being rewritten. We're living in times when there is a rejection of status quo politics. There's a rejection of austerity politics. There's an opening around the world, whether it's the Labor Party election, Jeremy Corbyn, whether it's a radical politics in Latin America, whether it's a pope who speaks about capitalism and the environment in ways he does. So there are all kinds of openings and possibilities. But one possibility is a deeply troubling one, that we see in Donald Trump a manifestation of a kind of rejection of conventional politics, but in that is also a resurgence of what has been a thread throughout American history. Demagogues, nativism. In the case of Donald Trump, it's a billionaire bully beating up on the most vulnerable, beating up on immigrants. I don't think that's what America at its best is about, but Donald Trump's riding the wave, Larry, there's no question. I'd say three other things. It's about spectacle, which our politics in many ways have become. It's about celebrity. It is about the weak field, surprisingly weak field this Republican Party has assembled. And fourth, something I hope we'll talk about is the media and the kind of wall-to-wall coverage 24/7, free media that Donald Trump gets and how that pushes him forward in a time of anxiety and in a time when our politics has become a lot about spectacle.
Speaking of the media, on the Democratic side, you have asserted that Bernie Sanders essentially is being marginalized in terms of media coverage. Who's responsible for that? Well, I thought he gets lots of coverage, doesn't he?
Let me step back, Larry. I think what's happened, and I did ABC This Week with George Stephanopoulos the day or two after Bernie Sanders announced, and he had a big interview with Stephanopoulos. And millions of people met him for the first time. And millions of people are meeting him for the first time, Larry, because on some level our media has treated Bernie Sanders in the last close on to 30 years he's been in Congress and then a senator as someone who has fringe views. Well, in fact, his views are majority views in many cases. Whether he wins or not, his agenda is an electable one. So what's happened in the last months, Larry, I would argue, is that just by force of facts on the ground, what we're witnessing in these extraordinary rallies, the Bernie surge, feel the burn, that the media has been forced to cover him. But it has been a painful, slow, tortuous ride. And the other thing you continue, I'm sure you feel this, Larry, I think you do, so much of Bernie Sanders' agenda, his issues, he's a serious candidate with serious solutions, are too often filtered through the prism of what does it mean for Hillary Clinton, now what does it mean for Joe Biden, instead of taking his issues at face value and explaining, but maybe I'm asking too much of much of the media. So, but I think we're moving now to a period where Bernie Sanders can't be ignored. I mean, people thought I was crazy months ago when I said, listen, the guy may win in New Hampshire, do very well in Iowa. We're witnessing that. You can't ignore it. So I take back that he's, no longer being heard or marginalized, but for a long period he was being.
Do you buy any of the thought that there are parallels between Trump and Bernie? They're both outsiders. They seem fearless about speaking their minds. They're both out there.
It is an important question, Larry. But I would say it's in the category of false equivalence, something we see too often in our media. I think the history of populism, the history of unconventional candidates, has been in our country one of reaction or reform, one of scapegoating or idealism, speaking to the better angels of our soul. And I see in Bernie Sanders someone who wants to build a world that is more fair. The rules aren't rigged against working people. He has serious ideas. He's laid it out. He has a racial justice agenda. Donald Trump, I think, believes he can shape the world and solve and tackle the problems of this country and the world by sheer force of ego, by sheer force of personality. He is also, as I said earlier, I think, in the spirit we've seen in American history of an American demagogue, of someone who is about reaction, of someone who is about scapegoating. And again, I don't think that's in the best of American tradition. However, we are in a moment of rewriting the rules. There's no question that Donald Trump is rewriting the rules and upending the rules of the establishment in the Republican Party, and boy, are they scared. I mean, they're running ads against him, the Club for Growth. He does say a few unconventional things about let's cut this hedge fund benefit, carried interest. But he, I think it's still at its fundamental root a campaign of ego and a campaign of scapegoating.
Funny country. In 1932, when Norman Thomas ran on the socialist ticket, he had 18 planks in his platform. They are now all law. All of those 18 planks. The last one was health plan for America. That was the only one that wasn't a law, now is. So basically, we say one thing, but we're really another country.
No, but we're also, Larry, what we see through the course of history. And the nation, not me, the nation turned 150 years old this year. And in 1932, we endorsed Norman Thomas for president. That is, I would argue, until we kind of got our bearings and then endorsed Franklin Delano Roosevelt for 3 terms. But Norman Thomas, what he did is what the nation, I hope, does at its best, which is we lay out ideas early on when they seem heretical, and then they're picked up. So what Bernie Sanders in some ways is doing is also speaking to a country which, when they hear these ideas, they really like them, but they're not hearing them in so much of the media. Norman Thomas had one of the great lines, Larry. He said, "I'm not a champion of lost causes. I'm a champion of causes waiting to be won." And I think to some extent that is also part of what, those outliers, those who resist often the brutal coercion of conventional wisdom and conformity confront in this country.
Evan Thomas's grandfather.
That's right. I think the granddaughter's working on a biography of Norman Thomas.
Yeah,
he was a great contributor to The Nation. Come to thenation.com, get our 150th issue. He wrote many brilliant essays.
All right, let's get into Hillary now. She
Okay.
continues to lead in the national polls, got a lot of money. She has a significant group of superdelegates. But still, there are thoughts, if Joe Biden gets in, she's in trouble. How do you assess Hillary campaign?
I think there's a fundamental tragedy here. I think, again, the times don't seem right for her. I mean, she's running as a kind of establishment candidate. However, what I don't understand, and again, coming back to kind of what I would argue is obsessive media coverage, I think the emails, legitimate issue, but it has so overshadowed so much else that's important that it sucked the oxygen out of her air. But I think she should be speaking much more forthrightly, much more passionately about what it would mean for this country to have a first woman president. So I think on that level, she's missing, and maybe it's not being heard, but she's not speaking as passionately to that. But it's a tough time, and I would argue that the era of inevitability is over. Where she heads and where that campaign heads now is a serious question. It is still leading. They're working all of the intricacies, of the apparatus, Larry, the bureaucracy, getting 400 superdelegates and this and that. But boy, the passion isn't around that campaign, and they must be worried about the Bernie surge.
Forgive the pun, is she also being trumped?
I think, as I said, this is a moment of upending the normal order of things. And the tragedy is she is running a more traditional candidacy in a time of vertiginous, tumultuous change when people are seeking something else. So yeah, it's Trumpism, and it's also what's going on with Bernie Sanders. I think what Bernie Sanders is doing is running a very strong campaign. He's speaking his mind. I love that he, amidst all the snark of so much political commentary, he refuses to be pushed to criticize Hillary Clinton. He continues to speak about the issues. But I think he's really captured the space which an Elizabeth Warren could have occupied, or someone who has the sense of the moment we're in.
In a new op-ed for the Washington Post, you said that U.S. hawks aren't giving the Iran deal a chance, and among those you warn may be helping to foreclose any broader transformation of U.S.-Iranian relations is Hillary Clinton.
Yeah, I mean,
now,
Larry,
she supports the deal, so what's the rub?
All right, so here's the thing. It's extraordinary. It's a very important moment that diplomacy, tough, muscular diplomacy, triumphed over military action. For too long in these last decades, our leaders have used military action, have moved to war without exhausting all diplomatic options. So I think it's a victory for peace. It's a defeat for warmongering. Here's the problem. We need to build on this Iran agreement. It's not just, and it's important, that it restrain Iran's nuclear program, but what about transforming the region, which is in chaos? What about partnering with countries in the region to rebuild a Middle East that isn't in chaos? And so I think that we're witnessing a closing off of options that could really rethink and transform the Middle East. And the bellicose posturing is not giving diplomacy breathing space. And Hillary Clinton, and this is also briefly, this campaign has not really seen an engagement, maybe the Republican debate, but we're not seeing an engagement in foreign affairs. Bernie Sanders hasn't really spoken out. Hillary Clinton's speech at Brookings last week tried to out-Reagan Reagan, Larry. I mean, he had the famous phrase in his workings with Gorbachev, trust but verify, with the Soviet Union. She's going on about distrust but verify. I mean, it's just a moment where one wants to lift up a successful agreement, say we got to build on it. There are all kinds of snapback provisions and tough, intrusive verification measures, but try and build on the spirit and don't reach for military action so quickly.
Katrina, I just spent a week in Italy, and the number one story everyone's talking about is the refugee crisis.
Of course.
And Obama says the United States will take its share. I think we're going to take 10,000. Where's that going? What do we do with all this? Is such a horrendous human problem. Where does it
Larry,
go? What happens to Germany? What's the answer?
Larry, the human misery, the horror of it. Do you know that it's the largest displacement of people since World War II?
No.
So I think the first thing we need to think about is compassion. How do we relieve the suffering of millions of refugees? We need to fund the UN. We need to fund humanitarian organizations. The United States, it's pitiful, Larry. Since 2011 and the Syrian conflict has taken 1,500. The president's now saying 10,000. Humanitarian organizations are urging the United States to take in at least 100,000. But at the heart of it, Larry, if we're not going to see displacement of more and more people, the horror of it is we need to address the root causes of the refugee crisis, the Syrian war, the chaos in the Middle East. And I think it's a very unpopular position, but we need to get people in a room to find a way. Maybe it's partitioning Syria, maybe it's a coalition government with a brutal dictator, but we need to stop the conflict, the hemorrhaging of blood lives. And the other thing, to go back to what I said, is we need to rethink how we deal with the world. There is no question that the U.S. invasion of Iraq, the funneling of arms into this region in these last years, the failure of the U.S., along with others, to resolve the Syrian conflict, has led to the spawning of ISIS and has led to this crisis, which is just unimaginable in its brutality and misery. So I think the world needs to pay attention. But again, as you know, in World War II and other times, we have a great spirit. America at its best takes in refugees, but we are far across the Atlantic. And I think Germany, which in many ways, you know, has failed in certain ways. I'm thinking of the dealings with Greece, but I think is showing that its history reminds it of its obligations. Sadly, Hungary, Larry.
Oh.
I mean, if you remember 1956 and the Soviet invasion of Hungary and the outpouring of aid for Hungarian refugees, what that government is doing, criminalizing refugees, is a shame, is an ugliness, a blight on Europe.
With the anti-immigrant feeling in America, do you think we're going to be open to that 10,000?
I think it will increase that number. I do. There is both a tug and a, you know, there's a tug in this country, Larry, as I said earlier, between the, you know, best angels of our nature and the scapegoating. I mean, what Donald Trump fails to bring in is that immigrants are a net positive for the economy, hardworking, entrepreneurial, innovative. It's part of our heritage. It will be very tough politically, but I do think that number of 10,000 will and must go up.
The lady in the harbor is crying.
You said it, Larry.
Back to the campaign. You think Joe Biden...
And by the way, let's hope that this issue, you know, finds its way into the campaign. I will say someone who gets no traction, Governor Martin O'Malley, was early and forceful in calling for 65,000 refugees to be brought into the United States. But
we're running out of time. You think Joe Biden might get in?
You know, never say never. I think it all depends on Hillary's fate and fortunes.
Katrina,
he's certainly making a run for it, literally and figuratively, right now.
Always great talking with you,
Thank
dear.
you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks to Katrina so much for being with us. And check out the nation.com and follow her writings in that paper as well as in the Washington Post.